Thomas Ashworth stood in the mud outside the Coldwater Bend courthouse holding the last $4.11 he owned in the world, and not one soul in that gray Wyoming crowd believed he would ever hold a hammer again. The bank that had swallowed his family's forge 3 months before had swallowed his name along with it, and the men who once called him neighbor now called him nothing at all. When the auctioneer's gavel fell on a rotted, roof-caved blacksmith shop at the far end of Renner Street, condemned, forgotten, worth less than the nails rusting loose in its walls, Thomas raised his hand and bought it for $4 even, while the whole crowd laughed before he had even finished signing his name. They called it the worst bargain in the territory. They did not know that beneath the warped floorboards of that ruined shop lay something sealed away for 11 years, something that would not only give Thomas back everything he had lost, but would quiet a debt the whole town of Coldwater Bend had been pretending, for over a decade, not to owe. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Thomas Ashworth. Before we begin, if stories of quiet men finding their way back from ruin speak to something in you, we'd be glad of your company a while longer, because there is a long road ahead of us tonight. Thomas had been born in 1852 in a valley outside Steubenville, Ohio, the third son of a blacksmith named Elias Ashworth, a broad, slow-spoken man who believed that iron, like a man's character, could not be rushed into its final shape. Elias kept a forge behind a whitewashed house with a sagging porch, and from the time Thomas could walk, he was made to sit on an overturned bucket just outside the ring of sparks and watch. He was not permitted to touch the tools until he was 9 years old, and even then, his first lesson was not swinging a hammer but learning to listen to the particular ring a piece of iron gave off when it was hot enough to bend, and the flatter, duller sound it made when it was not. When striking it would only waste the strength in a man's arm and the patience in his heart. Elias used to say that any fool could hit hot metal, but a smith worth his coal knew when to wait. Thomas carried that lesson through every year that followed, long after his father's hands grew too stiff with age to swing anything heavier than a walking cane, and long after the valley in Ohio had filled up with railroads and other, younger smiths, and there was no longer room enough for an Ashworth forge on every corner. It was Thomas's mother, Ruth, who taught him the other half of what he would need. Ruth Ashworth had been raised in a Quaker meeting house in Pennsylvania before she married Elias, and though she rarely spoke of doctrine, she lived by a plain conviction that nothing in this world was ever truly worthless, not a bent nail, not a cracked plow blade, not a man the town had given up on. She kept a mending basket by the hearth that held buttons other women threw away, and she was known, in her quiet fashion, for taking in stray animals and stray children alike when their own families could not or would not keep them. Thomas remembered her saying once, while sewing a shirt from a flour sack, that the Lord did not waste materials, only people wasted them, through carelessness or pride, and that it was a fine thing to be the sort of person who noticed what others had thrown away and asked why. He did not understand, as a boy, how deeply that idea would come to shape the whole of his life. He understood it only many years later, kneeling on a broken floor in Wyoming with a crowbar in his hand. At 19, restless and eager to make his own name rather than live forever in his father's shadow, Thomas set out west with a wagon of tools, a good horse named Samuel, and the particular confidence of a young man who has never yet been truly humbled. He worked his way through Nebraska and into the Dakota Territory doing forge work for railroad camps, shoeing horses, mending wagon wheels and plow irons, learning the harder trades of gunsmithing, repair and wheelwrighting from men who had no patience for apprentices but grudging respect for a boy who listened before he struck. It was in a rail town in the Dakotas that he met Sarah Coleman, a schoolteacher's daughter with a steady gaze and no patience for men who complained, and though this story is not one of romance, it would be dishonest of us not to say that Sarah's calm good sense steadied Thomas through more hard years than either of them expected, and that when she died of a fever in the winter of 1879, 3 years into their marriage and without children living past infancy, something in Thomas went quiet in a way it never fully recovered from. He did not speak of her often. He carried, instead, a small tin locket of hers in his coat pocket for the rest of his days, and it was, in its own way, another lesson in the same vein his mother had taught him, that a small, plain thing could hold more weight than anyone passing by would ever guess. By 1883, Grief-worn but not broken, Thomas made his way to the town of Coldwater Bend, a cattle and freight crossing in the Wyoming Territory built along a slow, silty river that gave the town its name, a place of perhaps 600 souls, 2 churches, 1 bank, and enough passing cattle drives each season to keep a hard-working blacksmith in steady business. He built up a modest forge of his own on the north end of town, married to no one now but his work, and for 3 years he shod horses, fitted wagon wheels, and mended the endless small breakages of a frontier community with the same unhurried patience his father had taught him. He was well liked, if not well known, the kind of man neighbors nodded to without quite remembering his first name, the kind of man whose worth is measured only after he is gone. He had, by the spring of 1886, begun at last to feel something like solid ground beneath him again. It would not last. The trouble began, as trouble so often does in a small cattle town, with a man who wanted more than his share and the means to take it. His name was Silas Radnor, and he had arrived in Coldwater Bend 2 years prior with money from somewhere no one asked too closely about, buying up notes on struggling businesses and quietly becoming the largest shareholder in the town's only bank. Radnor was not a cruel man in any way the town could point to outright. He smiled easily, tipped his hat to widows, and gave generously to the church building fund, but he possessed the particular cold patience of a man who understood that ruin could be delivered just as effectively through paperwork as through violence, and with far less mess. When a cattle disease swept through the region in the autumn of 1885 and thinned the herds that made up most of Thomas's business, Radnor's bank quietly began calling in notes across the district, timing each demand for the precise moment when a man's cash reserves were thinnest. Thomas had taken a modest loan 2 years earlier to expand his forge with a second furnace and a proper wheelwright's shed, a loan he had paid faithfully every quarter without a single missed payment, and he had no reason to expect that the bank would suddenly demand the balance in full, with 30 days' notice, citing a clause in fine print that Thomas, trusting the bank as most honest men trust an institution that has never wronged them, had never thought to read closely. He tried everything an honest man tries. He rode to Cheyenne to seek a second loan and was turned away, for word of Coldwater Bend's troubles had traveled ahead of him, planted, some said later, by Radnor's own hand. He sold his second furnace, his good anvil, even Samuel's replacement horse, a mare named Delia he had grown fond of, and still the sum fell short. He offered to sign over half the forge's future earnings for 5 years if the bank would simply extend the note, and was told, politely, that the bank's obligations were to its depositors, not its debtors, and that business was business. On the appointed day, Thomas stood on the courthouse steps and watched strangers walk through the forge his father's teachings had built, appraising his tools like cattle at market, and when the gavel fell that final time, the man who had spent 17 years learning that nothing was ever truly worthless discovered, for the first time in his life, the particular loneliness of being treated as though he himself was. He might have left Coldwater Bend entirely, as 3 other ruined men had done that same year, boarding the eastbound freight with nothing but a bedroll and a bitterness that would follow them the rest of their lives. But something in Thomas, his mother's old conviction, perhaps, worn thin but not extinguished, kept his boots planted in that town a little longer. He took a room above the mercantile on credit and a promise of odd labor, and it was there, 3 weeks after the auction that took his forge, that he heard old Ezra Whitcomb, the mercantile's owner, mention almost as an afterthought that the county was auctioning off a derelict property on Renner Street, the old Holloway blacksmith shop, empty and condemned for over a decade, roof half caved in, floor rotted through in places, being sold simply to clear the county's tax rolls of a worthless parcel nobody wanted. The starting bid, Ezra said with a short laugh, was set deliberately low, since the county did not expect any bidder at all. Thomas went to see it the next morning, walking the length of Renner Street past the shuttered storefronts that had once served the town's east side before the freight road shifted west, until he stood before a building that even the weeds seemed to have given up on. The double doors hung crooked on one hinge. The stone chimney had partly collapsed into the yard. Inside, where light fell through the broken roof in long gray shafts, he could see an old forge hearth gone cold and cracked, a scatter of rusted tools no thief had bothered to steal, and a floor of wide oak planks buckled and split from years of rain finding its way in. It was, by any sane measure, a foolish purchase for a man with $4 to his name, a building that would need more money to repair than it could ever be sold for. And yet Thomas stood in that ruined doorway for a long while, running his hand along the splintered frame, and felt something he had not expected to feel again so soon, a small, stubborn flicker of purpose. Whatever else this town and this bank had taken from him, they had not taken the thing his father had spent 17 years teaching him to trust, that a thing was not finished simply because everyone else had decided it was. At the courthouse auction 3 days later, Thomas raised his hand when the county clerk called for a starting bid of $4 on the Holloway property, and no other hand went up. There was laughter, not unkind exactly but not gentle either, the sort of laughter men reserve for a fellow who has clearly lost more than his fortune. Someone in the back remarked that Ashworth had bought himself a fine pile of kindling. The clerk, faintly amused himself, noted the sale, and Thomas signed the deed with the stub of a pencil, $4 poorer and, as far as the town of Coldwater Bend was concerned, no better off than he had been the week before. He walked back down Renner Street that afternoon with the deed folded in his coat pocket, next to Sarah's old tin locket, and told himself, without much conviction, that a roof was a roof, and a man needed somewhere to lay his tools even if the tools themselves were mostly memory now. It was on his second morning of clearing debris from the shop, hauling out broken lathe pieces and a collapsed section of the old bellows stand, that Thomas noticed something odd about the floor near the rear wall, close to where the Holloway family's living quarters must once have adjoined the working forge. 3 of the oak planks there sat slightly higher than the rest, not warped upward by water damage as the others were, but level and true, joined with a neatness that did not match the rough, hurried carpentry of the rest of the building. He knelt and pressed his palm against the wood and felt, beneath the dust, the faint seam of a cut that had been made deliberately, not by rot or accident. A blacksmith spends his whole life learning to read what a material wants to tell him, whether it is iron ready to bend or wood that has been worked by a careful hand for a private reason, and Thomas's instincts, dulled by grief and ruin as they were, had not entirely left him. He fetched a pry bar from the scattered tools and worked the edge of the nearest plank loose, and beneath it, in a shallow cavity lined with tar paper gone brittle with age, he found a tin document box no larger than a bread loaf, rusted at the corners but sealed tight, and beside it, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, a heavy iron key unlike any lock Thomas had seen in Coldwater Bend. He sat back on his heels in the gray morning light and stared at what he had found for a long while before he touched either object again, because something in the careful hiding of them told him plainly that whoever had put them there had meant for them to stay hidden a very long time, and had perhaps never intended to come back for them at all. Thomas carried the tin box and the iron key up to his rented room above the Mercantile that evening, and by lamplight, with the sort of unhurried patience his father had beaten into him at the forge, he worked the rusted latch free. Inside he found a bundle of papers wrapped in waxed cloth, remarkably well preserved, and as he unfolded them he understood, slowly and then all at once, that he was holding the private papers of Josiah Holloway, the very blacksmith who had built and worked that shop some 15 years before, a man Thomas had heard spoken of only rarely and always with a strange, careful vagueness, as though the town preferred not to remember him too closely. The papers told a story that took Thomas most of the night to piece together. Josiah Holloway, it emerged, had not simply closed his shop and moved on, as the town's brief version of events implied. He had been, in fact, one of the founding investors of the very bank that now stood at the center of Coldwater Bend, a partnership formed in 1871 among 4 local men, Holloway, a rancher named Cornelius Faust, a freight operator named Dunmore, and a 4th man whose name struck Thomas cold when he read it, for it was Aldous Radnor, father of the very Silas Radnor who now controlled the bank and had ruined Thomas's own forge. The ledger pages, in Holloway's cramped hand, recorded years of honest partnership, loans extended fairly to ranchers and freighters through the hard winters of the early 1870s, dividends split evenly among the 4 founders. But the later pages told a darker story. In 1874, following a drought that had thinned the town's cattle herds much as the recent sickness had thinned them again, Aldous Radnor had proposed to the other 3 partners that the bank quietly seize several struggling ranches through a manipulation of loan terms, buying the land cheaply through foreclosure and reselling it later at great profit once the drought passed. Halloway's ledger recorded his own refusal, in plain and angry words, and recorded too that Faust and Dunmore, worn down or perhaps simply persuaded, had eventually sided with Radnor, outvoting Halloway 3-1 on the bank's private board. Halloway had written that he intended to take his concerns to the Territorial Banking Commission in Cheyenne, and had begun compiling evidence, correspondence, ledger duplicates, sworn statements from 2 ranch families who had been wrongfully foreclosed upon, sufficient, he believed, to have the bank's charter revoked and Aldous Radnor personally prosecuted for fraud. He never made that trip. The last entry in Halloway's private ledger, dated the 11th of March, 1875, noted only that he had been offered a final chance to sell his shares quietly and leave the matter alone, and that he intended to refuse, and beneath that entry, in a different, hastier hand that was unmistakably still Halloway's own, was a single unfinished line, "They know I have the papers, and I do not." The sentence broke off entirely, the pen stroke trailing into nothing. 3 weeks later, according to a yellowed newspaper clipping folded among the papers, Josiah Halloway was reported to have left Coldwater Bend suddenly for reasons unknown, abandoning his shop and his half-share in the bank, which was subsequently bought out, quietly and at a steep discount, by the surviving partners. The clipping noted, almost as an aside, that Mrs. Halloway and her 2 children had followed some months later to join relatives in Kansas, and that the matter of the empty shop had been left to the county for want of any other claimant. There was no mention anywhere of what had truly become of Josiah Halloway, and Thomas, sitting alone in his rented room with the lamp burning low, understood that he was holding the one honest account of what had actually happened, hidden away by a man who had known, in his final weeks in that town, that he was in real danger, and had trusted no one enough to give it to them directly. The iron key, Thomas discovered 2 days later after long study of a small hand-drawn diagram folded among the papers, opened a strongbox that Halloway's notes indicated had been placed for safekeeping in the vault of the freight company office, not the bank itself, which Halloway had plainly no longer trusted, but the separate stone building belonging to Dunmore's freight line, where a private lockbox service had once been offered to merchants along Renner Street. Whether that freight office still stood, and whether such a box could possibly remain after 11 years, Thomas could not say, but the ledger's final pages made one thing unmistakably clear: Josiah Halloway had assembled proof, real, sworn, documented proof, that the bank now run by Silas Radnor had been built, in its earliest and most formative years, upon fraud against the very ranching families who had trusted it, and that at least 2 of those wronged families, the ledger named them as the Pruitts and the Odells, might still have living descendants in or near Coldwater Bend with a rightful claim against the bank that Thomas suspected Silas Radnor would move heaven and earth to keep buried. Thomas did not sleep that night. He sat with the papers spread before him on the narrow bed, Sarah's locket resting cool against his chest where it always sat in his coat pocket, and turned the plain, hard question over in his mind that any honest man in his position would have had to face. He had, in his hands, the means to see justice done for a wrong committed a decade before his own ruin, and he had, perhaps, in the freight office strongbox if it still existed, the means to recover something of value for himself as well, after everything that had been taken from him. It would have been easy, and by most measures forgivable, for a man so recently and so thoroughly wronged to think first of his own restoration. But his father's voice came back to him that night, the old lesson about waiting for iron to be ready before you struck it, and his mother's voice alongside it, the quiet insistence that nothing was worthless, that everyone deserved to be seen clearly rather than discarded, and Thomas understood, somewhere past midnight with the lamp guttering low, that the papers in his hands were not truly his prize to keep quiet and spend on himself. They belonged, in the fullest sense, to the town. The freight office on Renner Street, it turned out, had indeed survived, though it now operated under new ownership as a general storage depot, the old stone vault in its rear room mostly forgotten and used to store spare wagon parts. Thomas approached the current proprietor, a cautious, elderly man named Otis Freeling, with careful honesty rather than trickery, explaining that he had come into possession of a key to an old lockbox once held there and asking simply to see whether it still existed. Freeling, who remembered the old lockbox service from his predecessor's days and harbored no particular love for the bank himself, having lost a nephew's ranch to a Radnor foreclosure 2 winters back, allowed Thomas into the vault, and there, dust-covered and forgotten behind newer crates, stood a row of 6 iron strongboxes, each numbered, and the 4th of them answered to Josiah Halloway's key with a groan of long-rusted tumblers finally giving way. Inside, Thomas found not treasure in any conventional sense, though what he found would prove, in time, to be worth a great deal more than gold to the people who needed it most. There were duplicate copies of the fraudulent loan documents Halloway's ledger described, bearing Aldous Radnor's own signature authorizing the falsified foreclosure terms. There were sworn affidavits from the elder Pruitt and Odell family members, taken before a circuit judge in 1874 and never filed, describing precisely how their ranches had been seized on manufactured pretenses. And there was, folded separately and addressed simply to whoever should someday find it, a letter in Josiah Halloway's own hand, explaining that he feared for his family's safety, that he had been threatened plainly by men he would not name outright in writing, and that he was leaving Coldwater Bend not from cowardice but to protect his wife and children, trusting that someday, by whatever Providence saw fit, the truth he had preserved would find its way to daylight through hands more fortunate, or more patient than his own had proven to be. Word travels quickly in a small town, and it was not many days before Silas Radnor learned, through channels he had cultivated precisely for such purposes, that the ruined blacksmith who had bought the old Halloway shop for $4 had been seen in close conversation with Otis Freeling at the freight depot, and had subsequently made a discreet visit to the office of Judge Harmon Cole, the circuit judge who happened, fortunately for Thomas, to be a man of stern and old-fashioned integrity, untouched by Radnor's influence. Radnor wasted no time. He called on Thomas personally at the ruined shop 2 evenings later, arriving in a fine gray coat entirely out of place amid the sawdust and broken timber, and offered, with the same easy smile the town had always known him by, to purchase the shop back from Thomas at 10 times what he had paid, cash in hand that same evening, no questions asked. When Thomas declined politely, Radnor's smile did not waver, but his voice took on a colder edge beneath its courtesy, and he remarked that a man in Thomas's position, ruined, friendless, dependent on the goodwill of a town that could turn on him easily enough if certain rumors began to circulate about his character, would do well to consider how quickly fortune could worsen rather than improve. Thomas understood the shape of the threat clearly enough, though no threat had technically been spoken aloud, and he understood too, with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened him, that this was precisely the same pressure that had driven Josiah Halloway out of town 11 years before, and that the only way to survive it, where Halloway had failed, was to make certain the truth could no longer be silenced by driving away a single man. Over the following 2 weeks, Thomas moved with the same deliberate patience his father had taught him at the forge, striking only when the iron was ready. He brought the sworn affidavits and duplicate loan papers first to Judge Cole, who examined them at length and confirmed their apparent authenticity, and who agreed, gravely, to summon both the Pruitt and Odell families, still living within a day's ride of town, to review the documents concerning their own ranches. He sought out old Cornelius Faust, the second founding partner named in Halloway's ledger, now an elderly widower long retired from active involvement in the bank, and found in him a conscience that had evidently been quietly troubled for 11 years, for Faust, upon seeing Halloway's papers laid before him, wept openly and confessed that he had always suspected foul play in Halloway's sudden departure and had lacked the courage, all this time, to ask the questions that might have confirmed it. Faust agreed, without hesitation, to testify to what he knew of the original board's fraudulent decision. Meanwhile, Silas Radnor, sensing the ground shifting beneath him though not yet certain how much Thomas actually possessed, attempted to rally what allies he had among the town's merchants, suggesting privately that the newcomer blacksmith was stirring up old troubles for his own gain and could not be trusted, a strategy that had served the Radnor family well enough 11 years before but found far less purchase now, in a town that had watched Silas call in loans with cold precision through a hard winter and had already begun, quietly, to wonder about him. In the days between Radnor's visit and the formal hearing, the town itself seemed to hold its breath in a way Thomas had not expected. Some merchants along Renner Street, mindful of their own outstanding notes with the bank, grew suddenly cautious in how they greeted him, offering thin smiles and quick excuses to end conversations, and Thomas understood without needing to be told that fear of Radnor's ledger book still held more sway over some hearts than any love of plain justice. Old Ezra Whitcomb, however, who had first told Thomas of the auction and who had watched Radnor's bank tighten its grip on the town for 2 years with a growing unease he had never voiced aloud, surprised Thomas one evening by closing his mercantile early and walking the length of Renner Street to sit with him by the half-finished hearth, saying only that a man ought to know he was not entirely alone in a fight worth having. It was a small gesture, and Ezra made nothing grand of it, but Thomas would remember it for the rest of his life as the moment the tide in Coldwater Bend truly began to turn, for where one merchant found the courage to be seen standing beside the ruined blacksmith, others, more quietly and more slowly, began to follow. Radnor did not simply retreat after his failed visit to the shop. Within the week, whispers began moving through town that the newcomer blacksmith had perhaps stolen the Holloway papers rather than found them honestly, or worse, that he had forged them outright to extort money from a respectable institution, and for several uneasy days Thomas felt the old, familiar sting of being looked at sideways by men who had once, however faintly, respected his work. It was Judge Cole who put an end to that particular rumor, calling a brief public notice posted outside the courthouse confirming that the documents in question had already been examined and their provenance, including the manner and location of their discovery, formally recorded, a plain bureaucratic act that nonetheless did more to restore Thomas's standing than any argument he might have made on his own behalf. Radnor, for his part, grew visibly thinner and more clipped in his public manner as the weeks wore on, a man watching the careful architecture of 2 decades begin to shift beneath him, and though he made one further quiet offer to Thomas through an intermediary, a considerably larger sum than before, along with a veiled suggestion that Thomas might find life easier in some other territory altogether, Thomas declined a second time, and this time made certain that Judge Cole knew of the offer. As well, a decision that would later weigh heavily against Radnor's claims of innocence when the formal hearing finally arrived. The matter came to its resolution not in any dramatic courtroom scene but in the plain, unhurried manner such things are usually settled in a small territorial town, a formal hearing convened by Judge Cole in the Coldwater Bend courthouse, the same building where Thomas had stood with $4 in his pocket only weeks before, attended by the Pruitt and Odell descendants, by Cornelius Faust, by the territorial banking examiner Judge Cole had wired for from Cheyenne, and by a courtroom full of townspeople who had come, ostensibly, out of simple curiosity, but who left, every one of them, having witnessed something considerably larger than gossip. The examiner reviewed Holloway's original ledger, the duplicate documents, and Faust's sworn testimony, and found the evidence of the 1874 fraud sufficient to order an immediate audit of the bank's founding transactions, with particular attention to the Pruitt and Odell foreclosures. Silas Radnor, present in the courtroom and visibly shaken beneath his usual composure, attempted to argue that whatever his father had done a decade earlier bore no relation to his own present conduct, but the examiner noted, not unkindly but firmly, that the bank Silas now controlled had been built upon and had continued to profit from that original fraud without ever making restitution, and that the law took a considerably dim view of institutions that inherited ill-gotten gains and simply kept them. The audit that followed over the coming months would ultimately require the bank to return disputed land and provide financial restitution to both the Pruitt and Odell families, would see Silas Radnor quietly relinquish his controlling interest under threat of formal prosecution, and would, perhaps most significantly for the ordinary people of Coldwater Bend, expose a pattern of similarly harsh and questionable foreclosures conducted under Radnor's own more recent management, opening the door for several other struggling families, including, in time, a partial and hard-won restitution of Thomas's own original forged loan, which the examiner found had been called in under terms that mirrored the bank's older, fraudulent practices rather too closely to be coincidence. Thomas never asked for more than what was fair, and it is worth saying plainly that he could have asked for a great deal more. He might have used Holloway's papers as leverage for a private settlement, taken a quiet payoff, and said nothing further, as men in his position had certainly done before him. He might have pressed his own claim first and let the Pruitts and Odells wait their turn. He did neither. He insisted, from his very first conversation with Judge Cole, that the wronged ranching families be made whole before any consideration was given to his own circumstances, and it was this insistence, more than any single document in Holloway's tin box, that turned the town's opinion of Thomas Ashworth from curious skepticism into something closer to quiet respect. By late autumn, with his forged loan restitution finally settled and a portion of Holloway's own recovered bank shares, willed, as it turned out, by a final provision in Holloway's letter to whoever restored his name, to the rebuilding of the very shop he had lost, Thomas found himself with sufficient means to rebuild the Renner Street forge properly, a new roof, a new hearth, tools bought honestly rather than salvaged from ruin. He kept the old oak floor where he had found the tin box, patched but not replaced, as a private reminder of what patience and a careful eye could uncover in a thing everyone else had already given up on. And so we return, as we promised we would, to that muddy courthouse yard where a ruined man once stood with $4 in his pocket while a crowd laughed at the worst bargain in the territory. Thomas Ashworth did not buy a blacksmith shop that day, not truly, not in the way the crowd understood it. He bought back, without knowing it, the unfinished conscience of a town that had spent 11 years quietly forgetting a wrong it had never made right, and he did it not through violence or cunning but through the same slow, listening patience his father had taught him at a forge in Ohio decades before, the understanding that iron, and perhaps people too, could not be rushed into their true shape, only waited for, watched, and struck at exactly the right moment. His mother's old conviction, that nothing was ever truly worthless, only waiting to be noticed, had carried him from a mending basket by an Ohio hearth to a rotted floor on Renner Street, and had, in the end, restored to a whole community something far more valuable than the $4 he had spent to find it. Thomas Ashworth lived another 31 years in Coldwater Bend, and the forge he rebuilt on the ruins of Josiah Holloway's shop stood, by all local accounts, until well past the turn of the century, a plain, sturdy building known simply and without much fanfare as Ashworth's, where a man could always expect an honest price and an unhurried, careful hand. He never remarried, kept Sarah's locket in his coat pocket until the end of his days, and was known, in his later years, for a peculiar and much-loved habit of walking the length of Renner Street each autumn to look in on the Pruitt and Odell families, whose descendants he had helped make whole, though he rarely spoke of the reasons why, preferring, as his mother once had, to let quiet good rather than loud credit be the measure of a life well spent. We hope Thomas Ashworth's story stayed with you tonight the way the best of these old frontier stories tend to. If it did, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things, and overlooked people, are so rarely as worthless as the world first judges them to be. We would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something, or someone, that others had already written off? Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, stay close.